And we are live. Hello, word nerds. Happy Sunday. It is October the 20th in 2019. I am spreading out that intro just in case it takes a few seconds to send us up live. Anyway, today is 11 days away from Halloween, so we figured we would talk about the spooks. So we've been doing for several months now this series called Digging Deeper into Genre, where we pick a genre and we just really take it apart and talk about like what makes something that genre, how to write that genre well. So we've done one on paranormal, we've done contemporary. Did we do urban fantasy or did we do full fantasy?
It was urban and paranormal, I think.
Yeah, paranormal.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we've done a few. Definitely check those out if you haven't yet. Today, like I said, we're going to be talking all about horror. We've got Erin in the discussion section holding down the fort with a sick child at home. Welcome to Erin. And also to N. Griswold, Francesca Ellis, and the Nihilist Geek, who are all here. Thank you for joining us. So I'm going to open with just a really brief hit the high points history of horror as a genre, and then we can move into talking about all the things. This is like our more lecture feeling live chat, so it always feels very like, should I have worn my blazer?
Always.
Yeah. So horror is a story in which the focus is on creating a feeling of fear. In a way, pretty much all stories have a little bit of horror in them because there is always like stakes are kind of rooted in your character's fears. But horror as a genre focuses all the way on that, really leans into it. It can be traced back as early as the ancient Greeks and Romans, though my anthropological opinion would be that it goes back farther than that. We just haven't traced it there yet. Werewolf stories were popular in 15th century France. Honestly, like a lot of the original horror is pulled from themes of horrific things that happened in the 15th century. That's where you get a lot of like Vlad the Impaler and like fascination with serial killers comes from that era. Horace Walpole is credited with writing the first Gothic horror novel, The Castle of Otranto. I haven't read that one, but it was published in 1765, and it's kind of said that Gothic horror is what solidified horror as like a respected literary genre, at least in the English language. And then you've got Mary Shelley, who's credited with bringing pseudoscience into horror with Frankenstein in 1818. H.P. Lovecraft brought zombies in, or it's like one of the first times we see it recurring, with Cool Air, In the Vault, and The Outsider, which all came in the 1920s. Serial killers became a recurring theme in horror around the 20th century with like the rise of Robert Bloch's Psycho in 1959. And ever since then, it's kind of just really been expanding. We've got, classic people we think of, Stephen King, Shirley Jackson. You've got earlier than that, Edgar Allan Poe, and now as YA in middle grade are like in the last few decades, oh God, I'm old, becoming a thing. You've got like R.L. Stine. In YA, Amy Lukacs is one of like the biggest horror names. So definitely let us know if you've got any like classic horror authors that you love. You think if you like horror, then you got to read something by this author. Put it in the discussion section. I know my personal favorite is Shirley Jackson. She is great. And we're going to talk about this a little bit as we move on. Obviously, in a lot of the histories, they can be pretty whitewashed, pretty heteronormative. And so I think definitely let us know all your diverse horror recs as well. We've got the Nihilist Geek said, in my opinion, Bram Stoker was the first modern horror author, and then it was Lovecraft and Matheson who pushed the genre out of gothic fiction. Definitely Bram Stoker is huge for the horror genre. And again, all the things I just said, all the lecture things are very cursory, just kind of to give you an intro. So obviously horror has its toes dipped in a lot of subgenres. You can have like thriller, which is much more realistic. You can have sci-fi. Horror often brings in paranormal elements. And so I was wondering for the first question, what is the scariest book you guys have ever read? I'll start with Kelly.
Actually, no. Sorry, he's trying to give me an ice cream sandwich at exactly the wrong moment.
Or the right moment.
I know it's never a wrong time for an ice cream sandwich.
Anyways, I couldn't think of a specific horror book, but the one that stuck out in terms of like remembering how it made me feel was a middle grade book. It's the second book in the series. It's by Catherine Applegate. I don't know what the series. Oh, Remnants is the series, and it was the second one. And it's about basically an asteroid hits Earth, and at the end of the first book, all of the like possible survivors manage to leave on a spaceship and go into stasis for a couple hundred years. And then in the second book, they're all waking up, and like some of the people have been like eaten by worms over time, so they didn't survive. But then like later, some of them, like the worms are still in them and they get eaten. And like this one woman went in pregnant and woke up with like her baby had been born outside and its eyes melted. And it was all middle grade. It was all very intense. So It was more like
traumatizing young children.
Yeah. And like I think Catherine Applegate, she did like the Animorphs stuff, is known for like some pretty dark middle grade, but it definitely stuck out to me as like, this is horrific and not like it's not horror in that intense building creepiness, but it is just that imagination of all of the ways things can go wrong, which is never good for me.
Yeah. What about you, Helen?
I have like two kind of answers because I have one that's just a really specific scene, and then I have one that's an actual book. And the one that the scene is from is not a scary book. It's The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon by Stephen King, which is just about a little girl who gets lost in the woods. But there's a scene in the first like 4 chapters of it where she's trying to make her way through this forest, and she keeps like she'll like stand somewhere and find something like another tree, and she's like, okay, I'm gonna walk in a straight line for this tree. And so she walks in a straight line to that tree, and then she finds something else for a marker and walks in a straight line that way. And she thinks it's going to keep her, like she's going to be able to find her way back by doing that. And of course, she's not going to be able to because it's just a bunch of trees that all look the same. And the reason it got to me when I read it, I mean, I was like 12 or 13 reading a Stephen King book, which immediately is a red flag. But like in my part of BC, we have to learn like wildlife survival as part of my like grade 3 curriculum.
Oh no!
Because all of BC is like so heavily forested.
Too anxious for that.
And so like reading this thing and just being like, no, that's not what you do.
Worst case scenario.
So just like because of all of that, it like gave me so much anxiety, and so it's stuck with me. Like that scene is still so vivid in my head, and it still brings me so much anxiety, and I read it like 12 years ago. But then the book that is probably the scariest book I've read, even though it's not necessarily meant to be, is this book called Poison by Chris Wooding, which is a twisted fairy tale about a girl who names herself Poison, and her little sister gets kidnapped by the Fae, and she has to go on this big adventure to go and try and save her. And it's very meta towards the end, but there's a bunch of stuff in the middle that's just like perfect young adult horror. Like a scene that's always stuck out to me is she has to fight off a witch and her hellhounds, and like at some point they have to like skin these dogs and wear the fur like a suit. and it's not meant to be this horror scene or anything, but just the way it's described it's bone chilling and creepy. So
I'm sorry, how is that not a horror scene? Like,
it's not
What?
meant to be. That's the thing.
What?
Like, this whole thing is literally just meant to be like, no, okay, we have to get past this witch, and she's blind, and the only smell that she is used to is her dogs. So they kill her dogs and wear their fur to get through it. But it's
that
so
sounds like
messed
horror
up.
to me, man.
I read that. I think I was like 10.
Oh no!
And it messed me up. And then I reread it like 5 or 6 years ago, and it holds up. It's very good.
Yeah. Emma.
So Megan, you actually helped me figure out mine when you mentioned Amy Lukovic's, because mine is probably Daughters into Devils, which is one of her books. And it is fantastic. It's like one of those books that like I would love to see as a movie, because I think it was like very visual. Because it's like about this girl whose family moves from the mountains to the prairies in like, I don't know, like the 1800s or something. And she's like secretly pregnant, and she starts like losing her mind, and her whole family gets cabin fever, and it's like really creepy, and there's all this like weird stuff going on. But before you mentioned her, my answer was going to be The Call by Peter O'Gillen, which is also just like so creepy with like fairies and like very gory and everything.
We have a book club on it too.
Yeah. And it's very good. But I don't like read a lot of horror stuff, partly because it's like not quite my thing. Like I would prefer to read it as a short story, like read short stories versus full-length books if I am going to read horror. But also if I'm going to consume horror or creepy things in any way, I would rather watch a movie than read a book, because I often don't find scary books all that scary because like I can't see it. So it's just as much as my like imagination gives me, and I can like hold back. I don't know. I'm just kind of like, it's just
my mind is just like, nope.
Yeah, or like it's just
not
a book, but when I like, have to see scary things happening, I'm like, no, this is terrifying. Because like I've read The Shining by Stephen King, and I was like, this isn't that scary. But I feel like if I watched the movie, it would probably creep me out.
The movie's not bad. As someone who can't watch horror, like I love The Shining.
Yeah.
Because I was not impressed by the book. I didn't think it was scary at all.
Yeah.
Like,
The movie's not particularly scary, but it does like, it kind of makes your heart pound a couple times.
For sure. And we'll talk about that in a little bit ttoo, like the different kinds of horror. Because not all horror is necessarily like blood and guts. We'll get to that. Rachel.
I also do not read a lot of horror. I like a lot of dark, creepy, like eerie stuff, but not necessarily horror. But that being said, I would say the scariest book that I love the most is Illuminate by Amy Kaufman and Jay Kristoff. Because I think that format and that story go really well together, and it's both very gory and psychologically scary. And if you don't know, like living under a rock or something, it's a book that is about space zombies, and it's a visual medium, so it's written as like letters and reports, and some of it's pictures, some of it's emails, some of it's transcripts. So the way that it breaks up media is really interesting, and the way that that works to tell the story, I think, really adds to it, especially the countdown aspect. So that is one of my favorite horror novels, and I don't even like horror, and I'm reading it thinking like, it's so good, it's so bad, oh my god, and just like putting it down and picking it back up again because it was really great.
Yeah.
So that one like stuck with me the most.
Yeah, and that one also brings up a lot of like themes that are particularly horrific, like the idea of like, do you blow up this one ship to save this other one that has more people on it? Kind of like really the big picture ideas. Yeah, deep space, which is just
AI
horrific all on its own.
I've just realized I'm wearing a NASA shirt. So like, and then like murderous AI, and then zombies, and then
there's like a plague.
Countdown.
I will never forget there's like one page that's like this like flyer that like a child has like written all over, and is like, they keep watching me, like I'm, like they keep watching me, and it's like all this like crazy stuff like scribbled around it, and you're like, oh my gosh.
Yeah. Well, I think I also like that more because I've never been the person that's like, oh man, like I love movie monsters, like whatever, but like the things that can kind of, the things that are, cause as someone with like high anxiety, like you think about these things sort of, and then when you get like a psychologically thrilling book where you're like, oh my god, this could happen in some very vague sense, like that's what really gets to me. Even if it's a sci-fi book, it's still
yeah. Yeah, so we've got, like I mentioned, Erin, fellow word nerd Erin is in the discussion section today. And if I had to guess, I would guess she and I read the most horror. And she actually said the book that I was going to say, which was Bag of Bones by Stephen King. I'm usually like, for me, his plots aren't necessarily like I don't always find them like masterpieces of plotting or anything, but he has this way of doing like minor descriptions that just haunt me. So I remember like in Bag of Bones, pretty early on, this widower, he is in this cabin and he hears something and he looks under the bed and sees his dead wife looking at him.
Oh my
And
gosh.
he has which is spooky, not like I can't sleep tonight spooky, but then she had a bit of dust hanging off of her cheek. And for some reason, like the way he described that, like I was laying in bed that night and I was like, why did she have dust on her cheek? Why had she been down there for so long? But yes, so we've got a lot of good discussion going on. Missy Kate said the audiobook for Bag of Bones is also fantastic. So definitely check that out. Let's see here. Let me pull up my notes. So we talked a lot about all these different things, like what particularly scared us about them. And so I was wondering, what are y'all's tips for writing everyday things in a scary way?
That's a good question.
I would think look at all of its functions, or look at it in a way of, if I had to use this for something like other than its original purpose, like what could it be used for? Or like in an emergency, what could I use this for? Because if you're just, I don't know, in a kitchen and you're like, oh man, a soup spoon, but like if there was someone coming at you right now and that was the only thing that you had to defend yourself, like what would you do with it?
Yeah, for sure.
Say the question again. I feel like I want to like re-trigger something in my mind.
Okay, so we've got a lot of horror, like you go to the haunted house and that's where the horror takes place. But I feel like the most powerful horror takes everyday things and makes them scary. So how can we do that? How can we make things scary that wouldn't necessarily at first glance be terrifying?
That worked. Thank you. I was thinking about like tension and kind of not necessarily Chekhov's gun, but paying attention to something in a way that stands out and then kind of leading back to it and just building up any sort of feeling around the thing you want to be creepy, kind of working it into your pacing and not like more of an overall rather than a specific how to rate this thing as scary, but like setting that tone, I think, more than any specific description.
It reminds me of like in The Raven King when like she just keeps talking about how it's like
Oh my
6:21.
Yeah.
And you're like, what is 6:21? And it like makes you so nervous. And it's just a time of day. Like, but like it happens so many times. It starts making you nervous
so
every
many
time she
times,
says
and
it.
at times that you know for a fact it's not 6:21.
Yeah. You're like, something bad's gonna happen. I was also gonna say kind of along those lines, like when everyday things or like things that usually are normal, when like there's just like a little something that's off about it, that can be like really, really creepy. Like if the shadow of something like isn't where it should be, or like, yeah, the clock keeps saying it's 6:21 when it's not 6:21. Like just like those little things that like, you know, like there's like the very classic, like you're in the woods and suddenly everything's silent kind of thing when like normally there should be noise. So like not being quite right can really like add that tension.
And especially sometimes writing them in a way that the reader knows something isn't right, but the character hasn't noticed yet.
Yeah, for sure.
Always
That was a lot of horror authors talk about that, like creating that sense of knowing, like you know that the character should not go down in her pajamas into the basement to see what made that sound, but you also like kind of get it. Like you're kind of like, well, yeah, something's making a sound and she has no reason to believe it's a murderer.
Mhm.
And
also, are you any safer just staying up in your bed while there's a murderer in the house?
yeah, and so like you as a viewer are like, no, don't do it. But that made me think of I was reading in preparation for tonight about the different kinds of fear. So you could have like dread, shock, revulsion, paranoia. And dread is one that you guys all talked about the most just now. And I feel like it's one of the most powerful, just like that and unshakable sense that something terrible is about to happen.
Mhm. I think I mentioned it in some Word Nerd video that I did where I talked about tension and the whole, like, either A, letting your audience know something that your character doesn't, or having it vice versa. But having that tension of somebody knows something that someone else doesn't is very powerful, and especially when it's something bad, that is that like sense of dread because you know that you can't do anything to stop it. And if you're like, oh man, this guy likes this girl, but he doesn't know that she already has a boyfriend and he's gonna ask her out to the dance, it's like that kind of like superficial level. But if you have it as there's a demon in the basement and don't go down there because your soul's gonna get stolen, then like you could just keep upping the stakes and that will give you like a better and I don't know, higher caliber sense of dread.
Yeah, Sadie did that really, really well by Courtney Summers. That was one of our book club books a few months ago, where you as the reader saw certain bits of information revealed to Sadie and then different bits revealed to the podcast host. And so you would like hear him getting this information and you'd be like, no, you're going the wrong way. You're going the wrong way. Let's see. So in addition to dread, we've also got shock, which is an extreme or sudden, unexpected turn of events, if you didn't know what shock was. Yeah. Which in horror is typically revealed in like a gruesome way. It doesn't have to be, obviously. Your mileage may vary with anything we say on this channel.
I think horror, especially in horror books, shock is difficult. Like it's why I'm okay with reading horror versus watching horror, that I'm never really shocked by anything. Mm-hmm. And I don't know why, because it's still surprising me on the page, but it's doing it in my own pace in my own head.
Mm-hmm. It's not a jump scare. Like in a movie, there's gonna be like loud music and like something's gonna come out.
And that's what I can't handle.
Yeah.
And this, like it's...
Yeah. I think that's like part of, like why I don't find books as scary as movies. Like when it's not like visual like that. And there's not, like the combination of like visuals and music and like sound effects and all these things to like.
Yeah, definitely movies, they have a lot more ways to manipulate your emotional state, whereas books, you're trying to evoke this like primal fear in someone using only your words, which is so difficult to do, but it means that when someone does it well, it like really sticks with a reader.
Yes. I'm thinking right now, I'm gonna go back to Maggie Stiefvater because I mean, obviously, and I think it might also be in Raven King when, I mean, big spoilers ahead. When Adam is looking in the mirror and he's like, he has an itch in his eye, and there's this whole like body horror mirror scene, and I love it so much, and it's so creepy. And like that was the point where I was like, I hate this so much, but it's so good.
Yeah, and that goes in with like revulsion as a horror tactic. Like there's the Raven King has a ton of body horror in it. Like, is it Ronan who's having a dream where he sees himself eating his own hands?
No, they're in Cave's water and it's falling apart, and then they look and they see Adam, and Adam's just like eating his own hand. Like, and you're like, oh, what? No, why?
Aaron in the section said, yes, body horror gets to me.
And that's interesting because like that would be pretty horrific in a movie for me, and it would be scary, but like I guess because I get to set the tone in my head with the book, like all of those scenes were more surreal. The eye one was definitely farther on the creepy stage, but all those things felt more surreal than horror to me, just because half of reading a book is kind of writing it in your own head. So I didn't want it to be scary, so it wasn't.
I guess it sort of goes like the revulsion, but it also sort of goes with like unsettling, where it's I'm not a super versed in body horror, but just using that as an example, like that's something that is not normal and you've been told for your entire life is not normal. And so when you see it happening to like the nth degree, there's that sense of wrongness, and that is what the fear comes from. It's like that sense of unknown and that sense of revulsion and dread and just everything, like wanting to shy away from it. And that can be done, I find, very, very well, or just slightly, but like that's what I like to read in horror, like that unsettling, creepy, like sense of wrongness. I find is like so much better to me than like a jump scare.
Yeah. A very good therapist once told me that a lot of my anxiety in life was coming from the unknown. And that is very true in horror. Having a monster off screen is just about always going to be scarier than seeing the monster right in front of you on the page. And obviously there are exceptions, but for the most part, it's much scarier not knowing like where your antagonistic force, whether it's a monster or a person or just like an entity, like not knowing where they are and what they're doing, but knowing that they are affecting the plot is a lot scarier than being like, look at this thing, it's got so many tentacles. What?
That's one of the critiques for like the Babadook, isn't it? Because everyone was super scared until the last like 10 minutes when they show the Babadook. And then they were like, this is what it is. It's just a doofy looking dude in a top hat.
Yeah, cool.
It's like my mom always criticizes like giant spiders in movies, like Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter, because like she's really scared of spiders. And like when she reads something like Chamber of Secrets, like she's super creeped out by the giant spiders in it because she hates them. And then she sees them on screen and she's like, man, that's not a real spider, I can tell. And like it's not scary anymore.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely, I feel like in horror, when you're writing it, you have to focus so much on like showing instead of telling. And I know like a lot of times my typical advice is like, well, yeah, show, don't tell, but don't worry about it. But horror, it's like you can't just be like, and there were spiders, which were super spooky. Like, you have to describe it more in order to try and like get at that weird evolutionary part of someone, that like weird caveman part of your brain that is like, don't leave the cave, don't leave the fire. Yeah.
Like what, like if you think about a lot of creatures or monsters or what have you in media, you're like, okay, well, what are people scared of? What are you scared of? Oh, I'm scared of spiders, I'm scared of snakes, I'm scared of sharks, you know. And then it's like, okay, take pieces of that. So you make the spider 80 times bigger, or you make a monster that has 6 rows of teeth like a shark, or you know, you make a
sharks in the tornado.
You put sharks in That is the best scary movie of all time because it is so hilarious.
Yes.
Oh god, I love that movie so much. Sharknado. Also, I'm sorry, this is like really off topic, but the funniest, like the best, worst horror movie I have ever watched is called Ghost Shark. And everybody needs to see it in their life. It's so good. And by good, I mean it's absolutely horrendous. It's so funny. I mean, ghosts are scary. Sharks are scary. If we put them together, obviously it's a good horror movie.
Really scary.
Oh, very scary.
It's Chuck Wendig. I want to say I have a quote from him here about, he talks about the importance of horror existing alongside humor. He said, because both of them follow the same structure, they are very good partners. They're like kissing cousins. Because he said they have a setup, they ask a question, and then there's a punchline or a twist at the end. But one makes you laugh and one makes you feel like you're dying inside. And so a a lot of horror, you will find like parts, like breaths of humor in it. In part because it does follow like that, but also it's hard to have a whole novel of just horrific things. Emma mentioned preferring short stories, and that's actually why horror does a lot better in the short story realm. Like it's a lot easier to find horror anthologies than it is to find a horror section at your local Barnes and Noble, because a lot of times people will market it as something else. Illuminate market it as a sci-fi. We've got in the YA section, we've got the Devouring Grey and Saw Kill Girls and Wilder Girls, which would probably all be horror, but they're all marketed as like spec fic or contemporary fantasy, dark contemporary fantasy, because bookstores, they don't really have a place for horror as much anymore, even though people are still consuming it. Yeah, I also had a note here. Oh, Aaron had a comment, said Signs the movie was a great monster off-screen example.
Yeah.
Definitely. I was a big M. Night Shyamalan fan as a teen. That was actually, I know a lot of people hate The Village.
I love it.
Teen Megan saw it 4 times in theaters because I love it. The idea that it like plays on the idea of like the monster, once it's in front of you, isn't that scary. You see the costume and you're like, it's spooky, but is it really? And then you realize that like The Village, spoilers, that like the monster was the people you met along the way.
And it's like a lot of people were mad that it turned out it wasn't a real monster, but like, yeah, I thought that was really cool, like the twist on it, that like it was actually just the like village leaders trying to like keep everyone in this secluded society. It wasn't like in the olden days like you thought it was and stuff.
Yeah, and I'm a strong believer that people being awful and terrifying is equally, if not more, scary than an actual physical monster on the page.
Well, you can also look at horror movie monsters and be like, but they're not real, you know? So I know a ton of people that love horror movies because they're like, yeah, but, like I can be scared, but it's not real, like whatever. But when you see or read something about something that could potentially happen, or about just, oh, it's the neighbor that went crazy and murdered the whole neighborhood, you're like, oh my god, is my neighbor crazy? I can murder the whole neighborhood? Like, you know, like that's that other like whole aspect of fear that usually like resonates with people more.
When you were talking about like taking a shark and making it bigger, or giving a spider a bunch of teeth, that like to me, I am a little freaked out by sharks. But once you make it bigger, I'm not scared of it anymore because I know that's not a real thing. But like if you put it in a real scenario and you're like, oh, this could find me, it's a different thing psychologically.
Definitely. Well, it's also like if you put one, and I guess this could also deal with like certain genres that are not just horror, but if you take one thing, like you have to sell people on believing one thing. If you can make them believe one thing, then you're golden. And if you make people believe this is a totally normal world, but there are shark tornadoes, and if you can make them believe that, then that's what's scary. And obviously they didn't make you believe that. So you're like, lol, this is hilarious. But like, that shark just came out of a toilet. But like,
I feel like there is a genre of like cult horror films where it's like, we're not trying to scare you, like we're trying to amuse you, but with horror. We got some Village lovers in the discussion section. Welcome. We had a question from N. Griswold. What's the best way to set the tone at the beginning of your horror work in progress?
Good question.
I think I'd drop a hint of like of what's gonna come. If you're gonna make it super bloody, make it like this person just cut their finger, oh no. Or if it's gonna be really like creepy and spooky, maybe be like, oh, that clock's been at the same time for 10 minutes. Well, that's strange. Just like a little hint.
Yeah, I think it's kind of that wrongness we were talking about before. But it also depends on exactly what you want the tone to be. But just those little things worked in while things look like they're still normal.
Yeah. I also think that horror is one of the genres where like a prologue can actually serve a good purpose. Like, it can show like the creepy thing that the character is going to have to face later. And have, like set up, like even if you're starting it with just like this character who's just going about their day normally, and then something bad happens to them, you can start off by setting that tone by being like, there's actually a murderer in their town, or like there's this like creepy creature coming out of the depths.
To look for it in your first chapter.
Mhm.
Yeah. The scariest chapter I've ever read was a prologue, and it was in Meddling Kids, and for some reason it just really, like, it was one of those things where it just like really got to me. It was in the second person, and I want to say it was actually like a dream that someone was having that you found out in chapter 1, but it was horrifying. Definitely, I feel like thinking about atmosphere. I want to say I have a video somewhere on the Word Nerds about creating atmosphere in your book. So definitely check that out. I have a recommendation here in my notes on talking about like focusing on the 5 senses, but author Audrey Miano also talked about focusing on setting character and movements when you're writing horror. So making sure that you know the atmosphere, the setting of what you're writing, making sure you have a strong character, because that is still super, super important in horror. That's why a lot of those like cult horror films, you know, they're more funny because A, it's ridiculous, but also B, they don't often do a ton to try and make you care a lot about the characters. So there is that distance there. But then also the movements was the one that really got me thinking. Like there's a really big difference between someone moving like a dancer across the room and someone like really jerky moving across the room, and one is, depending on who is doing it, depending on the character, either of those could be much creepier. Let's see. So I've got a question here. What themes do you guys think humans tend to find the most frightening? Aside from the obvious death. So I'm springing these questions on them, so.
Something I always find creepy is like finding out that like someone isn't what you thought they were, or like who they thought you were. I always enjoy that in like a creepier story where like you find out somebody like is actually like bad in some way, or is actually like the villain that you've been like dreading all along was somebody like right beside you. That's always really scary.
Yeah. In that same area, kind of that something dark beneath the surface, like the lovely neighborhood where everything looks wonderful, or the perfect housewife, and then there's something else. I feel like we see a lot in that same kind of, you know, what else is going on that you're not seeing or not understanding properly, but looks like what you want.
I also like things that you found terrifying as a kid, and then it's like, oh no, that's like a thing. Like that always kind of messes me up. Like the idea of like young kids being scared of the monster in the closet, and then it's like you're an adult. It's like, oh no, there are monsters. Just deal with it. Especially like I'm a person who is terrified of the dark, so anything that's like, oh, like no, there's just something that's literally like just outside your field of vision, and it's gonna mess with you. Like that messes with me.
I was listening to which podcast? It was Ride or Die podcast with Clarabelle Ortega and Kat Cho. And they were interviewing Christine Lynn Herman, who wrote The Devouring Grey. And she was talking about how for some of the scarier scenes where she like really wanted to make you feel things, she has a scary basement that she went down there and wrote with the lights off so that she herself would also be scared while she was writing the things.
What method writing, my goodness.
Right? I'm not very good at it. Maybe I'll have to try it.
I think with like, it's not, I guess it sort of is horror. It's like holding hands with horror, where I have no secret. I love creepy fairy books so much, and kind of everything adjacent to that. So it's the thing that looks human or almost looks human, but isn't. And I really like that whole merging of like animal behavior or the something that's slightly off, the disturbing something, the when you realize that they don't have the same morals as you, and like that kind of thing is what I really like. I think it's also like the darkness beneath, because you're like, it's almost what I think it is, but it's not, and like that's what I really like.
Yeah.
It's familiar, but not quite.
Yes,
What you expect
exactly.
it to be.
Yeah. It kind of plays off of like what you were saying, Emma, about like the person you thought you knew
Mhm.
having this layer to them that was not what you knew.
Mhm. One of my favorite horror movies, and this kind of goes back to some of the stuff we were talking about at The Village too, is What Lies Beneath with Harrison Ford. Which, like, I guess spoilers for a movie that came out 19 years ago, but like you start out thinking that the monster is a ghost and that this is like that the haunting is the bad thing happening, and then like halfway through the movie you find out that like the ghost actually isn't the monster, like a human in the movie is the monster, and like that, like you didn't know who they truly were all along, and it's so well done and it's so good.
Had you seen that movie before we saw it together?
In college, no, that's the first time I'd seen it.
Story time. The first time I saw that movie, Emma and I were roommates in college, and we lived in this like first floor apartment that was kind of like half a basement.
Yeah,
So, yeah, it was like partially below ground, and we had a porch that was kind of up, so it kind of obstructed our view of things. And we had like our doors open, and it was cool outside. And there was all of us just like piled on this couch watching this movie with the lights off. And as you get to that point and you realize, and then the monster person is like chasing this person through the house, we are all just like clutching pillows and screaming. And people are like looking down into our apartment. We are just horrified. It was probably, maybe it was a group scare or something, but it was one of the scarier movies I've ever seen.
Really good.
Yeah.
It does get that whole like sometimes the scariest things are like the real things, not like ghosts. We're like, I don't believe in ghosts, whatever. But like when it's a real person is the thing to be scared of, then you're like, this could really happen. Like someone I know could be like this.
Yeah. All just like looking at each other afterwards. Like, we had a question. Have you seen The Others? Yes.
Also one of our favorites.
Yes. Also a Megan and Emma favorite from childhood. I'm trying to remember which one that is. It's got Nicole Kidman in it. And
it's like her and her children, like post World War II or something.
Oh, right.
Like house by themselves.
In their house.
Yeah, and they're being haunted.
Eyebrow raises.
Also a fantastic twist in that movie. Yeah, so good. I was really upset when Michael watched it for the first time and he guessed it. He was like, "Oh, this is what's happening," and I was like, "How dare you!"
What was the twist?
Okay, if you don't want to know the twist, take out your headphones, mute us. I'll wave my hands after. But the twist was that Nicole Kidman and her kids were the ghosts, and the ghosts were real people trying to move into their house.
What? Oh, that's cool.
It's really cool. And they were haunting the house.
That's all. Yeah,
weird.
I remember that.
Yeah.
So good.
I do like a good haunted house because those tend to be,
Mm-hmm.
not always, but some of them are less jump scare and more mood.
Mm-hmm.
So,
But we haven't talked about The Haunting of Hill House yet.
I literally just started watching it today.
Oh my god. Such a great adaptation. It's very, very, very different from the book, but
I imagine.
I loved it.
The book is only like
The book is like this long, but it's never explicit that it's ghosts in the book. And it is pretty explicit from the first episode in The Haunting of Hill House that there are ghosts. But yeah, I love the TV series. Obviously, it did a really good job of combining. It was mostly dread, which I hated and loved. But then they also had like some jump scares peppered in ways that weren't quite so expected. Because I feel like a lot of times if you've seen a lot of horror films and TV shows, you can kind of start to predict when those things are going to happen. But Hill House got me a couple times. And just like the really fascinating character dynamics really elevated the horror as well. One of the things I loved about the book was that it's told from Nellie's point of view, and she is kind of going to this house, and the house kind of takes claim of her mind and is like, welcome, you are house now. And I thought it was done really well, creating this sense of unease, because it was all from her point of view. You would get a lot of her kind of internal monologues, and you could see them like slowly shift from like, I'm thinking rationally, to I am angry, and the house is like what is making me feel these violent emotions. It was done so well.
That's great. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's one where like it is very unsettling, but I would recommend giving it a try if you're not really like a horror reader, but you are hoping to get more into the spooky things.
Mhm.
I think anything by Shirley Jackson is a great starter. I loved We Have Always Lived in the Castle, which the movie with Sebastian Stan is on Netflix now, and it's great. Yeah, and Griswold said I can't wait until season 2 of Haunting of Hill House, which I am very excited for as well. They're adapting The Turn of the Screw by Henry James.
Ooh.
I'm so but it's going to be like kind of like American Horror Story, where you have a bunch of the same cast coming back. So it's, and I was reading this interview talking about like it's plays into that horror thing we've been talking about of taking a familiar face and making it unfamiliar leads to the unsettling feeling. So I'm very excited. I have a lot of feelings about it. I had a recommended exercise for if you're hoping to write spooky things. I would definitely recommend taking your notebook or your writing program, whatever it is you're using for writing, take a page and make a list of 10 or 20 things that scare you personally the most. And then you can refer back to it as you're writing. When you're coming up with your plot, you can look at like, are there themes in here that I find the most frightening? I know in one of my books, one of the things that I wrote down on my list that I have was like the darkness within, like this idea that any of us could be capable of really dark things put in the right circumstances. Like that's very frightening to me. And so I like to play with that a lot with my characters. And it can be anything like big like that down to like, I don't like moths. They're creepy and moths are big in horror.
Over here, like, I love moths. They're so fluttery and adorable.
Yeah, they're pretty.
As we're talking about horror, there's a black cat that showed up.
Yeah.
My roommate's cat is
Aw.
very lovely today.
She's very cute.
Chat has been blessed. I feel like at least a third of the lives I've been a part of, a cat has shown up. Because either Watson wants in, or now Orf. This is Orf, by the way.
I love Rob.
Yes,
He's
terrifying. Tiny house demon.
Yeah.
He would be the perfect witch's familiar.
Exactly.
But he's dumb as a bag of rocks, but we will.
See, I'm going to move us forward a little bit. I feel like I could probably talk for another hour about horror, which I was worried about before we started this chat. I should not have been worried. Let's talk about plot twists. I know, yeah. Let's talk about plot twists. Do you think a scary story needs a plot twist?
Not necessarily.
Yeah.
Like the best example I can think of that doesn't really have a plot twist. It's not the best movie overall, but I really like it. It's called The Strangers, and it stars Liv Tyler. Yes. Which is literally just about a couple who goes to a cottage, and there are some like teenage weirdos who put on some masks and try to kill them. And the whole point is that they have no idea who these people are. They don't know them. They have no reason to do it. They just do it because they think it'll be a good time. And there's no plot twist in that at all.
Yeah.
The book I mentioned at the beginning, Daughters Unto Devils, like there's no plot twist that I can remember. It's just super creepy things happen.
Yeah. Like, you probably need to ramp up to a climax, but you don't necessarily need a plot twist. And the climactic moment doesn't have to be a plot twist. It just has to be
I would
worse.
say thrillers often need to have a twist of some
Yes,
sort.
I would agree with that.
Yeah, and in horror, I think there's something to be said for knowing something horrible is coming, and it and eventually it gets there. Like it's
Like, you can't really do a plot twist. I mean, you could do a plot twist in horror of like, oh, the scary monster was the people all along. Like, that could be it. But yeah, it's not necessarily like, oh, the plot twist is that actually it's a good ghost and they just want to hang out.
And then
Surprise! It's Casper.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So like,
Yeah, I feel like the plot twists tend to make for the memorable ones in a lot of cases, just because horror tends to have a good reputation with plot twists, but it's not necessary.
I was thinking slasher films in particular aren't really known for having plot twists. Like Halloween, the movie, you know that it's going to end with a showdown with Michael Myers, and it does. And like the only thing you don't know is whether they're going to win or lose the showdown. But it's still horrifying and very high stress.
Although on the scale, Cabin in the Woods, which I finally watched like this last year, which was like that slasher kind of thing, but then with this big plot twist of it, it's not quite that, which was interesting, but it's not what makes it scary. It's just what makes it interesting.
Yeah, if your story feels like it has room for a plot twist, then go for it. But if it's like you're like, it's horror, I should put a twist in, like readers will probably see it coming and it won't have the effect you want it to.
Yeah.
Let's see. I had a special note here. That doesn't mean just because you don't need a plot twist doesn't mean that you don't need conflict. Like, it can't just be gore. I mean, maybe there's some sort of genre that's really into that, but generally to have a powerful story, you need plot conflict in addition to all of that.
I think especially going from like books versus movies, like you're not going to get a pure slasher in books in the same way because it's so visual. So you need that extra layer of not that being hacked to death isn't genuine conflict, but
there's got to be some internal conflict happening.
Yeah. All of that being said, like you mentioned, a good plot twist in horror can really, really stick with you. And it can be considered like oh yeah, it's a horror. So there was a plot twist that I didn't see coming that really shocked me. One of the kinds of fear I mentioned earlier. So, but obviously horror's been around a while. There's been a lot of stories told. How can you try to make your plot twist surprising for the reader when there are a lot of plot twists kind of held as staples of horror plot twists?
I was gonna say that's like really hard because there's like a few specific types of plot twists that are really common, like they were all dead, or like like the best friend was actually the killer. Like those are like hard to pull off now because they've been done so many times. So I don't know the answer.
And that's where the mixing of genres with horror seems to be so much more prevalent now, especially in YA, where it's just like a genre mashup all on its own. Of like, won't say the book now because it'll give everything away, but a book some of us have read that they were all dead that you didn't see coming, or Emma probably did. But
no, that one I didn't. Actually. That's why I think that book's so good.
Yeah, it is great.
Yeah.
It's a shame I can't recommend it to anyone right now.
I do think like you definitely, if you're going to be doing like one of those categories of twists that has been done a lot in horror and thriller, you really, really have to be pulling the reader in so much that they just don't think about it. Because I think that's when it is done best, is when you just don't suspect because you're so caught up in the story and you're so caught up in like what the character thinks is happening that you don't question it. And that can be really hard because, like, how do you captivate people that well?
A lot of this feels really challenging. Like, I imagined it is tough to pants a horror book. Well, I guess you could just do it.
But tough to revise a lot after. So we're getting close to the hour mark. So we'll work on bringing it to the close in the next little bit. But what are some cliches, some horror movie or books, horror story cliches that you guys know of? Like if you think of horror, you think of that. So there's like, they were dead the whole time, or person you thought was dead is not actually dead. That's a pretty big trope.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think the character tropes are pretty
Yeah.
prevalent.
The couple who has sex gets murdered on the first stage.
Yep.
Yep. The dumb blonde. He's like, "What's that noise?" And you're like, "Oh God."
There's almost never a smart person in
Yeah, right. I just recently finished a book, and one of the characters did the thing where they're going to into like a scary situation, and they took their phone out to record it so that they could send this evidence to somebody. And I'm like, finally, a smart character. This
That's
is
a
great.
huge trope. Is like, oh, they don't. Sure, they have a phone, but they don't have service. That's how we get around.
Yeah.
the
Yeah,
phone.
yeah.
And I
get that,
love
right.
when they take something like that, where it's like, no, let's have them do something really smart with this. And I love seeing a villain or an antagonistic force that gets around that anyway.
Mhm.
Oh, burning down whatever is haunting you. That's a
yeah.
cliche.
Yeah.
Fire.
Effective.
Effective.
Sometimes, yeah.
I know, like that was one of the only things I didn't love about Bag of Bones was like, oh, so we burn the thing and then the problem's gone. Like it didn't feel that fresh to me. And Griswold said, I like the killer is among us tropes, definitely.
Mhm.
Just on your note about horror and like freshness and stuff, I feel like in almost every other genre, it's okay to reuse tropes, and like horror, you're expected to find that new thing, which is probably why there's less of it. Of like, you need something fresh in a lot of cases in order to stand out. Whereas you're writing a sci-fi, you've got your crew and you're doing a heist and whatever. Like you don't need to find a new spin on an entire genre. Whereas horror, it feels like the stakes are a bit higher.
You have like a really unique take on something.
Yeah, or if you are going to do the trope, because like tropes are tropes for a reason, but it is very like if you are going to burn the thing, then you need to make the climax particularly interesting
Yeah.
to make the burning the bones or whatever a satisfying ending.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah, it feels like a lot of people pick up certain genres because they love the quirky characters or the dragons, or like, and in horror, a lot of people like to be surprised. So
Yeah, you like to be scared, and you do get desensitized a little bit
Mhm.
to some of the scary things.
Yeah. Well, also, like, I guess the mass market appeal, so many people write about spiders or snakes or sharks or whatever, the dark, the ghosts,
Mhm.
like, it's just because those are, like, everybody's scared of that, or, like, so many people are scared of that. So people are like, oh, I've seen this before, like, what have you. So I think it's also more difficult to come up with things that are genuinely scary to a large audience that is also different.
I'd be curious to find more like modern takes on horror, like getting into technology and basically Black Mirror. But
well, there's that movie coming out with, I just remember Kristen Stewart's in it. That's like she's a part of a bunch of marine biologists that go down to the ocean floor, and then there's like a big leak in their ship, and they all have to like walk out on the ocean floor to like
that.
help. They'll have to walk out, and then of course, there's something down there with them and whatever, and like that's, I guess, more of like a modern
It's the
take
deep
on
space
it.
of like literally our planet.
Yes.
Like,
Deep space and the deep ocean are two things that are not explored, and there's so many
For
options there.
reasons.
For reasons, because they're creepy.
One that this is a personal favorite of mine, and it's not a movie or a book, but like video game wise, Until Dawn is fantastic, and it plays like a movie. But it does a very good job of kind of misleading you into what the horror is going to be. But the actual horror doesn't feel like a cheap twist. The way that it did it.
Yeah.
And they play with you in terms of like there's like a don't move mechanic, and you literally have to hold the controller perfectly still. And like kind of mess with you a bit. It's wonderful, and the company that did it just started a horror anthology series as well. I think I have it here. What's the first game? Men of Medan, which also plays with like some twisty things, not quite as well as Until Dawn does, but
video games is a great medium for modern horror because you're in
so
there.
good.
Yeah.
You guys remember when like Slender Man was a thing? That game.
Yeah.
Oh man.
You couldn't pay me to play Slender Man, but I'll play Until Dawn like 20 times over.
Could not have paid me to stop playing Slender Man.
The Kristen Stewart movie is called Underwater, by the way. It comes out in January.
Mhm.
Okay. Well,
It reminds me-
boring title that I remember it.
Yeah.
It's a great trailer, but like
Mhm.
It reminds me of a great like sci-fi horror book is Pitch Dark by Courtney Alameda.
I need to read that.
Which is like this whole like there was like this like one ship that was like supposed to be like leaving Earth for like a new settlement or whatever, and they never make it, and so they like wake up out of stasis and like they're stuck in the middle of space, and like part of their crew like mutated into these like monsters. It's so creepy. It's really good.
Yeah, sci-fi has a lot of like really good horror. I was thinking of like Aaron Bowman's Contagion was also pretty spooky.
I love that one.
I do love some good plague horror.
oh, I gotta do that too.
Yeah, we had a question from Vanessa. Okay, you answered it.
I did. I answered it in the chat while people were talking.
Perfect.
Until Dawn. It's wonderful. Please check it out. It's cheap. It deserves more recognition.
We also had a question, is the movie Poltergeist horror? I would say yes. It scared me when I was a child. And I think a lot of like the older movies, we watch them now and it's like not that scary because the special effects. But like, A, back then it was pretty scary. And also B, like something, it doesn't necessarily always have to be like, oh, spook all the time to be a horror.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking about, it made me think about The Langoliers, which was an old movie that I saw when I was a child. And it was a case of the monsters on screen aren't that scary. They looked like Furbies. They were just like these angry like things. But there was a part in it because they like slowly make you lose your mind basically. And one of the guys, he's in a suit, he's like a flight attendant, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, and he is starting to lose it, and he decides to murder the rest of the cast. And so there's a part where you see someone going to walk into a room, and you see this guy standing behind the door with a knife, and 10-year-old Megan was messed up by that. Still checks behind doors just to be sure.
That's interesting because I read the Langoliers short story. I don't remember the like monsters at all, but that story stuck with me. I loved it, but it was never about the monsters.
No, the monsters, I didn't think they were the scary part of that movie. I haven't read the story, but so I've got a couple last topics. So let's talk about antagonists. Make sure your antagonists have a consistent strength level. That's a pretty big horror cliche that I don't think you should do. Is like at one moment, like we see it kind of with It, the scary sewer clown. It can like destroy you with one look, but then also like the kids are able to kind of trap it. I love It. Please don't come at me if you love It. But there is like a little bit of like the, okay, well, how strong is he really? And that's if it is like a straight up creature and not like The Mist or something.
You could definitely, maybe we get to throw your reader off, like start with it being weak or being pretending to be weak, and then gaining power or like showing off its true form or what have you.
And also make sure that your antagonist, whatever it is smart enough to sustain a full story. That's a problem that can happen in a lot of books that are trying to be spooky, is that the antagonist just isn't that smart. And so it's like, why haven't these people figured out how to get rid of this thing yet?
Oh, uh-oh. Megan, your
Me then?
mic is
Okay, I thought
gone.
that was me.
Yeah, I was like, what is happening?
Uh-oh. All I hear is
When
high
you talk,
pitch.
there's like a buzzing noise when you talk.
Oh god, this is the beginning of a horror movie.
Our resident horror experts.
One by one, our cameras go black.
The plot.
We should have pre-planned that end. That would have been amazing.
Oh damn, we should have. Oh
That would have
man.
been so good.
Is that better?
Yay!
We'll tell
For
the
some reason, it
twist.
switched to my webcam mic, which is broken.
Oh.
But what was I going to say? Yeah, that was definitely the start of a horror movie. Oh, I love when horror story characters make a choice that they think is going to best their antagonist, and then they realize that the antagonist was smarter than they thought they were, and they are a couple steps ahead of them and have already prepared for that thing. I have a Chuck Wendig quote here somewhere. Oh yeah. He said, horror is made of grave missteps. Like when a girl hears a sound in the basement and goes to investigate. We know this is a terrible idea because we know it's a horror story. She doesn't. He calls it a micro moment of tragedy. He says like horror is a lot of micro moments of like tragic mistakes. And when you're doing the POV or tense, your character doesn't necessarily know that they're making a micro tragedy. Be careful with POV and tense, blah, blah, blah. We've been going over an hour, so I'm not going to make us sit here and talk about that. Yay, horror is making a resurgence. Vampires are coming back. Someone mentioned it earlier, and I was like, oh, that's what we're closing with. Renee Ahdieh has a book called The Beautiful that is vampires.
It was good.
Yeah,
It was not as scary as I was expecting it to be, and it was not as vampire-y as I was expecting it to be.
Oh, no.
But I really like the main character.
Yes.
So, yes.
I'm excited.
It was interesting. And I'm hoping they're going to vamp it up, no pun intended, in the second one.
Pun intended.
Not actually, but totally intended.
We've also got witches are starting to have a bit of a moment. We've got E. Latimer, our word nerd Aaron, has Witches of Ash and Ruin coming out in March.
You can pre-order it now.
Yes, and it is
It's so beautiful. Oh my
god. Did anyone have any final thoughts on like horror as a genre, things you would like to see in horror? Final tips.
It's gotten me more interested in incorporating horror elements into genres I will actually write. I can't see myself ever writing a horror, but it sounds like it would be fun and challenging. So like I want to, but I won't.
And yeah, definitely let us know any of your favorite things that you would love to see more of in horror stories, or stories that are definitely horror but aren't being marketed as horror right now, because it's kind of hard in the publishing world to market it as horror right now. Let us know all that in the comments or the discussion section as we are wrapping up. Thank you so much to everyone who was here. This was a great chat. We had a ton of people in the discussion section. We are so happy to have had you here. And next week is our book club, right?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, next week is book club. It is not a horror. It is
The
Red,
exact
White, and
opposite.
Royal Blue. Yeah, Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston. It's a rom-com.
It's adorable.
It is
so good.
I am so excited to talk about it. It's a very fast read. I read it in like one sitting. So definitely pick it up at your library or your bookstore if you haven't had a chance to read it yet. And hopefully we will see you all then. And I think that's it.
Enjoy spooky season.
Yes, enjoy spooky season. Thank you for coming. Bye.
Bye.